Hi there and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now, you may have noticed, if you're a regular listener, in the last few weeks the number of episodes has sort of gone down a bit, and that's basically because I've been moving house and most of my recording gear has been at the bottom of a box somewhere. So here we are in the new abode and the stack of history books next to me. We've got some great interviews coming up in the coming week. You should have two for you. I don't want to kind of spoil the surprises, but I think you're going to be pretty pleased. Today I'm talking mainly about some of the sort of the kind of misconceptions that we have around the effects of Thatcherism, and the kind of the contradictions that exist within this phase of conservatism that begins in the mid-1970s, that in many ways can't be thought of as being particularly conservative at all. These aren't new ideas particularly, but much of what parades as conservatism around the world now, in Britain and America's a slightly different story, but not that dissimilar, is a kind of a very strange hybrid of kind of extreme social conservatism. If you look at both Britain and America, the Conservative Party in Britain and the Republican Party in America fight these endless culture wars on questions of race and gender and sexuality, and some kind of last-ditch attempt to fend off modernity. But they also employ the kinds of economic policies that for 4 or 5 decades have led to the very social fragmentation that they profess to decry. So we're going to try to kind of delve into this and explore this a little bit with the help of John Gray, the philosopher, who by no means a kind of an anti-Thatcherite really, and during the 1980s was quite favoured by Margaret Thatcher from time to time, but is a figure who sort of has kind of drifted between left and right. This is perhaps not how he described himself, but it's certainly I don't think his critique can be seen as particularly a left critique. Anyway, so here in his book False Dawn, The Delusions of Global Capitalism, he writes about the development of kind of this period of globalization, which he describes as the development of a global free market. I would doubt whether you could really ever say that from the 70s, between the 70s and, shall we say, 2008, a global free market emerged, but that's a slightly different conversation. He writes, Thatcherite economic policies strengthened and accelerated most of the social and economic forces that have subsequently resulted in the dissolution of traditional families and communities. They set British society on a forced march into late modernity. The role of Thatcherism as a modernising project is rarely understood. The backward-looking character of market liberal ideology can be deceptive. Re-engineering the free market in late modern Britain dissolved the last remnants of the social order that has sustained it in the 19th century. Not only the traditional family, but the class culture of deference and respectability, which had been indispensable to the free market, have largely been swept away. So the 1980s particularly is this period, rather like the 1960s, of kind of social transformation. Popularly, we think of the 1960s as a period of social revolution. I have often believed that the 1980s saw a far greater social revolution in terms of class mobility, in terms of things like gay rights, in terms of advancing rights for black and Asian people. It's a time of retrenchment of those things as well, with things like Section 28, stop and search laws, and partly the kind of the resistance against these repressive policies accounts for the gains and the achievements of minority groups in the 1980s. But you could also argue that the 1980s is a period in which things like women's rights and again gay rights take a step forward, perhaps because of the struggles of previous generations too. Very often the people that proposed and fought for change in the 1960s had to wait for a later generation in order for these things to kind of materialise. Anyway, what Thatcherism did, or some critics argue that Thatcherism really followed these social changes, but this critique suggests that Thatcherism brought these social changes about. What it did was to, through the unleashing of market forces, dissolve previous social systems and social structures which had held things like deference in place. For example, when credit becomes more widely available and working class people can afford holidays and cars and consumerism and all these sorts of things, one an instinctive question they ask themselves as their living standards appear to transform, even if this is kind of fueled by debt and borrowing, is if we have nice things, if we have living standards which are equivalent to our social betters, why are we bowing and scraping to them? And the opportunities for kind of entrepreneurialism, for further study, for social geographical kind of mobility, for people to go and live in different towns and cities. People where I am in the kind of the poverty-struck South Wales valleys of the 1980s could simply go and live in London and live far more exciting, multicultural, cosmopolitan, and interesting lifestyles from the sort of the more insular communities that they come from. All of this changes experience, it changes expectation, it changes the way we see the world, and it brings about generational social change when lots of people do this sort of thing. So the old world of conservatism, as exemplified by the Tory grandees of people like, popularly Harold Macmillan, or the Tory Wets in Thatcher's cabinet, people like Willie Whitelaw or Jim Pryor, their version of conservatism was that the working man should be treated reasonably well, but that there should be not a great deal of kind of social progression. This was the world of the kind of the grandees, and the people with a kind of titles and wealth. Macmillan certainly was one of those, and also those who, a great many of them, who had served as officers during the Second World War, and in Macmillan's case the First World War. Thatcher was not from that world. Thatcher, not working class, but lower middle class, like Heath was probably actually you could define him as being working class. These were and John Major after Thatcher certainly has working class origins. These were the kinds of figures that came from a kind of a very active pool of conservative voters. The sort of the petty bourgeoisie who had come up from working class origins didn't want to go back to them, and resented working class collectivism. They resented trade unions as anti-competitive and anti-individualistic, and a means by which their hard-earned taxes could be redirected towards the undeserving. These are sort of like rather unpleasant sort of petty bourgeois prejudices. But Margaret Thatcher viewed the gentleman aristocrats of the Conservative Party with a great deal of suspicion, and she viewed them as being complacent, and she viewed them as being part of a certain kind of elitist backwardness, which she saw every bit as toxic and as dangerous to her vision of the country as Britain's trade unions. She took it in her mind that she was going to break two elites, really, the trade unions and the hold of the kind of hold of gentleman capitalists over the Conservative Party and over the City of London. Obviously, in the first group, she fared far better. When I've been recently talking about David Edgerton's brilliant book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, His argument was that Margaret Thatcher failed in every single undertaking that she embarked on, bar one. Her great failure, her only success, if you will, was the defeat of socialism in Great Britain. The thing that she wanted to bring about, which was perhaps her greatest failure, was the re-establishment of manufacturing in Britain. And this kind of ambition speaks volumes about, I guess, a kind of an economic illiteracy or a naivety on her part, in that every policy she employed was almost guaranteed to destroy it. There was an assumption on Thatcher's part, as a result of reading things like Hayek and Milton Friedman, that simply by exposing the British industry to market forces, one would suddenly bring about this kind of revolution in competitiveness. And Britain had been, probably since the 1870s, struggling from low investment. If you look at the headlines today, about a week ago, it was revealed that since the turn of the 21st century, Britain has missed out on something like about £500 billion of public and private investment, which is why, as one might see as a casual observer in Britain, nothing works at all at the moment. So low investment is a kind of a long-running problem for the country. And this kind of accounts for a great deal of Britain's declining competitiveness and gradual decline in Britain's manufacturing industries. The idea that simply putting the feet of Britain's manufacturers to the fire and exposing them to the kind of the policies that brought about kind of radical competition in the 1980s was somehow going to improve things, was something of a kind of a blinkered ideological assumption. John Gray writes, unperceived and never comprehended by Thatcherism's vociferous ideologues and their blinkered disciples, one effect of Thatcher's policies was to subject Britain's deformed class culture to a modernisation more far-reaching than any Labour had ever attempted. In imposing a forced modernisation on many aspects of life in Britain, Thatcherism made the projects of its chief political rivals obsolete. It marginalised one nation Toryism in the Conservative Party and the Social Democrats who broke away from the Labour Party in the early 1980s. Neither had a clear sight of the scale of the changes that were afoot in Britain. In different ways, each depended on a class culture that Thatcherism was eroding. The rout of these contending political projects was one of the new right's signal successes in Britain. But in displacing these tendencies from the political centre ground in Britain, Thatcherism created some of the conditions for its own demise. One of Thatcherism's main ironies was its relationship with the nation-state. Neoliberal economic policies stripped the nation-state of most of its leverage over national economic life, while Thatcherite public rhetoric clothed this denuded institution with an archaic veil of authority. Thatcher was, first and foremost, long before she inherited any kind of economic ideology, Margaret Thatcher was a nationalist. She believed in Britain in a way she felt others had ceased to. Margaret Thatcher thought that it was possible, by undoing the kind of the 1945 settlement, the development of the welfare state, to create a rejuvenised, resurgent Britain, a Britain that she remembered, a Britain of sort of small shopkeepers, the likes of her father, Alderman Roberts in Grantham, a Britain based on personal responsibility. Her view of the welfare state was that the welfare state was fundamentally immoral. then it was immoral, because it eroded the instinct in people to take responsibility for themselves, but also to take responsibility for helping their neighbours. Margaret Thatcher basically said that if the poor are to be helped, and she never necessarily advocated the complete stripping away of all social safety, partly because she thought it was politically unachievable more than anything else. But she thought that what in her mind socialism in Britain had done, it's debatable whether actual socialism's ever been tried in Britain, but what she believed it had done is it had disempowered people from philanthropy, and that giving to others should be voluntary, and that it is just encouraged to be to give to others and to help thy neighbour, and this is the act of a good Christian. But the immorality of the welfare state meant that it robbed people of their personal agency to give to others, which is, there are numerous holes in that argument, and it's kind of shooting fish in a barrel to go after them. And sometimes it's more important than kind of looking for the obvious low-hanging fruit in arguments, to just look at the argument for what it is and get a sense of the kind of the mindset that we're talking about here. I think with when it talks in what John Gray is writing about this kind of social transformation, the kind of the old version of conservatism relied on a kind of a middle class that was largely allied to the Tory project, and parts of the middle class had drifted progressively to the left during the 1960s and 70s, and it relied on a kind of a deferential working class. The new working class voters that embraced Thatcherism in the 1980s embraced it in a kind of a transactional way. They embraced it because Margaret Thatcher allowed for council house sales. They embraced it because there was a widespread resentment towards the trade union movement as a result of the crises of the 1970s, and the sort of popular working class tabloids attacking the union movement. The union movement is far from being without blame itself. And the problem that the Labour Party had is that firstly they see kind of a traditional working class voter base eroding, but also working class Labour Party local constituency Labour parties became transformed during the 1970s as working class members stayed away, and middle class educated public servants, teachers, college lecturers, lawyers, and people who had very different ideological positions on what the Labour Party should be doing rose to prominence within constituency parties. When you have this sort of popular resentment towards the left of the Labour Party, most recently exemplified by Jeremy Corbyn, and the sort of like a kind of an ill-fitting parody of those sorts of people who did take a keen interest in struggles in South Africa and Nicaragua and Chile and places like that. There was this kind of popular view of working class Labour members that these people have their head in the clouds. They're more interested in what's happening on the other side of the world than they are about kind of housing in their own community, which again is completely unfair and untrue. What Thatcherism and sort of Thatcherism's kind of successor regimes and Major, Blair and Cameron and Osborne and all the other host of Tories that have come since, what these governments have had to defend is a gradually increasingly globalised economy, And on one level, that globalized economy has provided, more diverse goods and services, which is, okay. There have been, some improvements in living standards as a result of this wave of cheap goods that are largely manufactured in China. It gave Britain in the first decade of the 2000s this huge kind of unrecognised pay rise for what is becoming an increasingly low wage economy. However, what has been globalized as well is control over the kind of the functioning parts of the British economy. If you look at the crisis of Britain's water system, which was privatised and is now owned by private equity firms in Wall Street and institutional investors in the Middle East, and national governments across Europe and investors and banks in Australia, Britain's water industry is a means by which wealth can be extracted from Great Britain, and this is precisely how investors see things. The state has this kind of strange role in protecting this sell-off of British national assets, railways and other, and also key industries, national champion industries such as Britain's car industry, and defending that politically and sometimes even physically using the forces of law and order to prevent a threat to that economic model. Of course, for a party that presents itself as a kind of the backbone of the social order, something that maintains the status quo and something that maintains kind of national pride and national interests, there's a kind of a direct and radical contradiction there. One that previous iterations of the Tory party would never have allowed. The basis of Tory party donorship has switched from being the small businessman from in the mid 1960s and 70s, and even in the 1980s, the petit bourgeois, the kind of the small town car dealer, or the solicitor, or the doctor, would have been the kind of person that attended conferences and got their hands in their pockets for a couple of grand. Now, as we know, donations are globalized and far greater, far more dubious. So the Conservative Party, in this kind of transformation from Thatcher onwards, has tried to kind of hold together this contradictory position of being the party of family and nation, while kind of presiding over almost a sort of disintegration of the nation. And this is the kind of the undoing of conservatism that John Gray writes about. A rhetoric of inexorable economic globalization was combined with the assertion of the unique authority and indispensable utility of a common national culture. Britain's relationship with the European Union, and this was written long before Brexit, was condemned as a fetter on its national sovereignty by Tory neoliberals who held that no national government could hope to buck world markets. One of the great ironies of Brexit as well is that if one wanted to take back control, which in a increasingly globalized world is something of an absurdity in its right, Brussels is the least of your worries, really. In a world where kind of financial decisions, as we saw with Liz Truss the other year, and mixed blessings there, really. In a world where the decisions of governments are reviewed by markets, particularly bond markets, markets that were full of people that buy government debt every day, and if they are found wanting the currency tanks, the idea of taking back control and becoming some kind of sort of autarkic national economy that can do its own thing is a bit of a nonsense. But perhaps those that came up with the idea of Brexit didn't really reflect on that. Who knows? The sovereign nation state was glorified, writes John Gray, at just the historical moment when those who elevated it declared it to be economically redundant. In the mass media, Thatcherite policies positively promoted the fragmentation of the common national culture by globalisation. Genuinely national institutions such as the BBC were attacked relentlessly, while commercial internationalisation of the media was actively begun. The nation state was denied any central role, even in the renewal of national culture. So Thatcherism cherry-picked, really. I mean, and perhaps all kind of ideological positions are similar to this. Thatcherism cherry-picked the aspects of national culture which it chose to maintain and uphold, and yet embraced the kind of economic forces which were most likely to dissolve it. And in there is the kinds of contradictions which I think it's taken really 40 years to fully realise. I think Brexit was perhaps a kind of an incoherent and confused sort of convulsion against that sort of erosion of people, and people had witnessed it for a long time. And we shall see next year, when the general election happens, how much the future of the Conservative Party, if there is one, is determined by what remaining. I think there's an awful lot of it still. Remaining British national sentiment. It may just be that British people decide, to put it mildly, that they want their country back, and this time it won't be from the shadowy bureaucrats in Brussels. Anyway, I'll leave you there. So we've got 2 amazing interviews coming later this week. They're going to be really, really cool. I'll put some notes on the website about those a little bit later on. But I'll be hopefully putting out a few more podcasts now that we are back up and running and everything's working fine. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.